Good evening. This is Whiskey Zero Delta Delta Zulu. My name is Dave, and I am net control for tonight's Northern Colorado Amateur Radio Club TechNet. Tonight, our topic is the basics of HF propagation, including the D, E, F, F0, F2 layers, etc. Let's start by taking some check-ins, seeing who's out there. If you'd like to check into tonight's net, please call.
Kilo Echo Zero, Sierra Oscar Romeo Mike, northwest of Wellington.
Kilo Alpha 6, Echo Tango Echo, Jim, mobile this evening in Loveland.
Kilo Echo Zero Romeo X-ray Foxtrot Randy in Loveland, Fort Collins. Kilo Delta Zero Tango Yankee Uniform Joe in Loveland.
Says Kilo Echo Zero, Lima Charlie Kilo, KE0LCK, the other Mike from Windsor.
November Zero Echo Mike Papa, Greg, Fort Collins.
Kilo Delta Zero, Yankee Oscar Papa, Scott in Fort Collins.
Kilo Echo Zero Tango Mike Delta, Ryan in Loveland.
Okay, I'd like to welcome KE0SOR Mike, KA6ETE Jim, KE0RXF Randy, KD0TYU Joe, KE0LCK Mike, N0EMP Greg, KD0YOP. I did not get the name on YOP. Will you please come again with that?
This is KD0YOP, Scott in Fort Collins.
Thank you, Scott. And KE0TMD, Ryan. Anyone else who'd like to check in, please call.
Dave, this is W0ASP, Terry in Berthoud.
Good evening, Terry, W0ASP, and I believe there was a double with you. Double, please come again.
2 perfect doubles.
I got W0ASP. Whoever went with Terry, come again.
Alpha Echo Zero Bravo Quebec, Daryl in Longmont.
I believe I got AE0BQ. Was that correct? And please come with your call or with your name.
That's correct. AE0BQ Alpha Echo Zero Bravo Quebec, Daryl in Longmont.
Good evening, Daryl, and whoever doubled with Daryl, please come.
Kilo Echo Zero, Tango Mike, Echo Ian, West Greeley.
Kilo Echo Zero, Tango Mike Echo, Ian, good evening. Any other check-ins for tonight's Northern Colorado Amateur Radio Club TechNet? Please call.
Zero LEV.
November 0, Delta November Bravo, Mac, and I'm mobile in Denver.
This is KB0SCX, Georgian Worth It.
This is Alpha Echo Zero, Charlie, Foxtrot, Ben, look hold.
Good evening to W0LEV Dave, N0DNB Mac, KB0SCX George, and AE0CF Ben. Any other check-ins for tonight's Northern Colorado Amateur Radio Club TechNet, please call.
Kilo Alpha Zero, Alpha Bravo Victor. This is Rhodes in Milliken.
K0ABV, good evening, Rhodes. Anyone else who'd like to check in, please call.
Kilo Delta Zero, Whiskey Bravo Charlie, Pete, Fort Collins.
Good evening, Pete. So like I said, our topic tonight is HF propagation and everything that goes along with that. Kevin was late getting home, so he asked me to start the net. I'm not as prepared as I'm betting he was for this, so if somebody could give us a little start and kind of tell us about HF propagation and how it applies to us amateurs. Anybody want to give that a go?
Oh, I'll start. Am I making the repeater okay?
You have a beautiful signal, Dave. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, well, number one, and most important to the technicians especially, HF propagation is vastly different than VHF UHF, and vastly different than simplex on VHF UHF. Unlike VHF UHF, which is either line of sight or wonderfully scattered off the big rocks to our west, most of HF propagation happens off the ionosphere from roughly 100 kilometers up through 3,000 kilometers. Terry, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just thinking of the ionograms. What forms the ionosphere is ionization. And the ionosphere consists of several labeled layers, both determined by the type of gases at the various altitudes and, of course, solar activity that produces the ionization. That's enough for a start.
Thank you, Dave. And does anybody want to expand on that or ask any questions? Please call.
EMP.
Go ahead, Greg.
So we get these different layers of the ionosphere that come and go throughout the day. They all start fading away after sunset. at different rates, and they all start building up at sunrise. And when HF radio waves interact with these layers, the waves bend. It's called refraction. It's like if you stick a pencil in a glass of water and look at it, it looks bent. It's because the light rays are bending. Same with radio waves in the ionosphere. It's not a reflection like hitting a solid wall. It's a bending that occurs in the different regions at different altitudes. And the different frequencies in the HF band react differently in the different layers. And the angle that your radio wave leaves your antenna is also a big factor. My favorite mode, NVIS, is called Near Vertical Incident Skywave, where you're trying to shoot pretty well straight up and bounce straight back down and cover about a 400-mile radius. Let me reset this. That only works up to about 8 megahertz, because even when like 20 meters is open or 18 or 10 meters is open at lower angles, if you're shooting straight up, if you're above about 8 megahertz, you're just going to keep on going. You're not going to come back down. The DX, people talking to other countries, they're trying to get a lower takeoff angle from their antenna and be shooting more out towards the horizon than straight up or up at a high angle. And those rays or waves tend to bend easier because it's a shallower angle that they're hitting the ionosphere at, and curve back down and reach further out. And we'll hand it off to someone else here to fill in some more N0 EMP.
Thanks, Greg. Any questions so far for either Greg or Dave or anybody who would like to answer them? Please call. Okay, so let's see. What are the best tools, or what tools have you found for us to look at the radio wave propagation on I mean, because I know it's changing as the day is going on. What tools are you using to figure out where we are today?
W0LEV.
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, maybe a bit to digest on first or second or fifth visit, but the ionograms, especially the Boulder ionogram, is an excellent resource. I will confess it looks quite intimidating to begin with, but the more you use it, the more you will realize it's a valuable resource. The URL is a bit long, so forgive me, but here goes. The usual https://www. Everybody knows that, and it is an HTTPS. After the www, .ngdc, that's Nancy George Denmark Charlie, .NOAA, Nancy Ocean Alpha Alpha, .gov for our government, /STP Sierra Tango Papa, / and these are all caps, IONO, Ida Ocean Nancy Ocean, / RT as in Roger Tango, dash, lowercase IONO, / latest, / latest, and those are both lowercase, .html. That is a tremendously useful resource for determining what's going on in the ionosphere, especially locally if you access the Boulder ionogram. Yeah, one additional comment in that respect. Most of the, well, if not all of the propagation prognostications aimed at the amateur community start there, or at least they should. It's an invaluable resource for HF.
EMP.
Go ahead, Greg. I was just getting that link down to put in the description of the video so we can find that later. But go ahead, Greg.
The other tool is your ears and your receiver. And almost always when the path is open in one direction, it's open in the opposite direction as well. So you can tune around in the various bands, and you'll learn that there's some kind of general rules of thumb, like 80 meters being nighttime, and then 40 meters, kind of a day-night combination, 20 meters being daytime, and then right now we don't normally have 10 meters, but I guess it's open rarely every now and then, but that would be daytime as well. But you tune around in the bands and see what you can hear from your location. And if you can hear somebody in North Carolina on 20 meters, you can probably talk back to them on 20 meters. As an extension of that, there are now a ton of online software-defined receivers, including over 300 Kiwi SDRs at sdr.hu, and you can connect to those on the internet and see what they're hearing and see where they are and get an idea, and you can see if they can hear you, and if so, then you probably have a path there. N0 EMP.
Yeah, I'd like to amplify that a bit, Greg. I guess I have it. Yeah, when I started all this, I didn't understand any of this. I knew about the delayer, which produces lots of absorption during the day, goes away at night. That's why we can hear distant stations on AM broadcast during the day. During the night. Daytime, delayer is there. It absorbs all of that energy, and we can't receive distant AM broadcast stations. Same goes for 160 and, to a large extent, 80 meters, 8075. Actually, rather than dig in, well, not rather than, but complementary to the ionograms, listening and tuning around is probably the best way to learn the whys and wherefores of HF propagation. I started with crystal radio. I don't know how many I built, and graduated to my first receiver. Heaven forbid call it a receiver. He'd get AR3. I heard all kinds of stuff, and that was during the peak of the peak sunspot cycles, 57 through 60. It was sweet. 10 meters was open all day, and a good portion of the night into Europe and Pac Rim. That isn't so today. We're pretty much at the bottom of the solar cycle between 24 and 25. But listening around will teach you all kinds of stuff about propagation. Greg is right. W0LEV.
Thank you, Dave and Greg. Does anybody have any questions so far?
Well, is anybody a new general discovering this stuff?
So let's dig in on what you were saying there, Dave, on the solar cycle. I know we're at the bottom of the solar cycle right now. Tell us some about what that means and how long that cycle lasts. Tell us about that cycle, please.
Well, hopefully everybody knows our star, the sun, goes through an 11-year cycle. 11 years between peaks, 11 years between nulls, which is where we are now. There are other additional, less prevalent cycles, but the 11-year cycle is very, very clear, going way back to the, oh, Terry, you'll have to correct me, 1700s, maybe. 11-year solar cycle, and we're at pretty much the bottom, between 24 and 25, so don't expect much. At night, even 20 meters, 30 meters, pretty much dead at night. 40 meters, it's going to be active most of the day and night with different skip distances based on how high the ionospheric layers are. 80 meters and 160, of course, are nighttime bands, regardless of solar activity. The one interesting thing that technicians can cash in on, and this is going a bit away from your question, Dave, is 6 meters. We get E and sporadic E, which typically happens nominally about 100 kilometers in altitude. Very, very interesting propagation mode. That's one reason 6 meters is called the magic band. And again, you can see the formation of E sub S, E layer, sporadic E on the ionogram quite clearly. 10 meters may also be open during times of high sporadic E or E activity. I strayed from your question, Dave, but is that enough?
Yeah, it definitely gives us an idea. It's hard to imagine what the peak of the cycle is like when you've... for myself personally, I've only had my license on the null of the cycle, really. So it's only really what I'm told about the peak of the cycle versus what I've actually seen over my ham career. You know what I mean?
Yes, sir, I do. I can give you a first-hand explanation of what I remember. 1957 to 60. I got my first license in 60. 10 meters. I didn't have much of a receiver. I hate to even call it a receiver, the Heath AR3. And during the day and occasionally at night, I typed the twin lead from our really rather poor TV antenna up on the chimney. And 10 meters was open really all day and all night to Europe and Pacific Rim. It was sweet. We haven't had it that good since then, so it's coming. Probably another year to year and a half before we start up into cycle 25. But lots of interesting stuff, and as we go up into cycle 25, expect the higher frequencies to be open longer. Expect them to be a bit more reliable. Expect better DX if that's your thing. But we got to wait a couple of years yet. W0LED.
This is Whiskey Zero Delta Delta Zulu with the Northern Colorado Amateur Radio Club TechNet. Does anybody have any questions so far? Please call.
KA0ABV with a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Rhodes.
One thing I've never been able to keep straight in my head, and I'm sure there's several people listening who can clarify this for me. Solar flares and solar storms, are those good or bad for propagation? I can never remember.
Good question. Terry can probably give a better answer, but I'll try. Typically, the amateur ties propagation to sunspot numbers. I personally don't. Again, consult the ionogram. Solar flares are short-term events where they put out typically a lot of X-rays, a lot of UV, which is very good for ionization of the ionosphere. So good that they generally decimate the F0, F2. HF is kind of like somebody lit off a hydrogen bomb at a couple hundred, 200, 300, 400 kilometers. HF goes dead, but typically VHF lights up, especially 6 meters. That's a solar flare. Another emission from the sun coronal mass ejection, or CME, which we just had. For instance, 2 days ago and part of yesterday, HF was exceptionally good for the bottom of the solar cycle. Those are particulate emissions, that is typically solar protons from the sun. And those aren't so strong they aren't so strong that they produce destructive ionization. It is very, very heavy ionization that we can't even get to the F layers. HF really kind of lit up a couple days ago because of CME, and that depends on the polarization of the magnetic fields associated with the CME and the Earth, but I won't go into that. That gets too technical. Sunspots, well, yeah, they produce emissions, but they're not the major contributor to HF propagation, even though amateurs think they are. Personally, CMEs and solar flares have far more effect than, when you get up into major, big-time sunspot numbers, yes, it does. But 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, 10 or 20 additional sunspots aren't going to make much of a difference. W0LEV.
Thanks, Rhodes, for the question, and Dave for the answer. Did that cover your question, Dave? Or, I'm sorry, Rhodes?
Yeah, it certainly helped. Basically, it's complicated. But no, that helped out quite a bit. So thank you for the input. Back to net control, KA0ABV.
Any other questions, please call.
EMP with a comment and then a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
The comment is a short answer for Rhodes, is the solar flares and CMEs can help some bands at some times, and they can absolutely destroy other bands at other times for all the reasons that Dave went into. So you can get some enhancement in some areas and absolute devastation in other areas. Let me mute my phone here. The question went to sunspots, and I had thought, and maybe from what Dave just said, I may be wrong, the solar cycle is most well known for when we're at the peak we have lots of sunspots, and when we're at a minimum we don't have many sunspots. So I thought it was the sunspots driving the ionosphere. My question was, sunspots look dark, and therefore you would think they're cold, but perhaps they actually give off more X-rays and more ultraviolet, and maybe that's why they drive the ionosphere during the solar maximum. But then Dave just alluded to something that they're not a big factor. So if they're not a big factor, well, if they are a big factor, why? And if they're not a big factor, then what is driving the ionosphere during solar maximum and 0 EMP?
From experience, Terry's probably going to have to answer that. But Terry will have to answer that. He's better at it than I am in that respect. I just speak from experience. Amateurs tend to hang everything on sunspot number, and I think that's more historic than anything else. There's also the solar flux index, which I think is given every day on the high noon net. I've talked with Terry a fair amount on this, and I think a lot of it is historical. What we do today and what we publish today is trying to replicate what was done 100, 200 years ago, so we have continuity in the data. There are better ways to predict propagation than what was used 100 years ago, certainly. But the data is trying to be congruous with historical data, so we're stuck with it. At least that was my conclusion last time Terry and I addressed the question.
I did hear Terry under there. I think it may have been doubling, but your audio was very low, Terry. You want to just give me a radio check, make sure we can hear you? Ooh, Terry, you are very, very quiet. Is your mic muffled or whatnot?
W0ASP, trying again.
That's a little bit better.
I sometimes have some issues with contact in this microphone.
Oh, that time it was much better. That time was good.
Okay, yeah, a lot of questions here, and some things to try to clarify. Is we use sunspots because we've been looking at them for hundreds of years, and that gives us sort of a long-term idea of what the sun is doing. But the ionosphere is actually created by ultraviolet radiation from the sun, ultraviolet light. And the amount of ultraviolet light the sun puts out is roughly correlated with the sunspots because it's emitted by these cold sunspot regions. That's just kind of the way the sun works, is in these cooler regions, ultraviolet light can get out of the sun's atmosphere better than it can without sunspots. And the more ultraviolet light there is, the more ionosphere there is. And that then lets us propagate at higher frequencies and longer distances.
So the sunspots produce a window in the solar atmosphere for the UV to exit the solar atmosphere.
It's a little more complicated than that, but that's an approximate model.
Totally totally understand, Terry. I'll keep the technicalities out of this discussion.
Yeah, that's a very good explanation. Does that answer your question, Greg?
It does. Thank you very much.
Any other questions or comments? This is Whiskey Zero Delta Delta Zulu with the Northern Colorado Amateur Radio Club TechNet. We are talking about HF propagation. Any questions for our experts? We do have a few resident experts here.
Your question?
Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
I suppose this is more of a general issue, I guess. Basically, I don't know. Maybe it wasn't like the last. I don't know when was the last time I played around with a shortwave, but recently, like this past year or so, I've gotten a couple of playing with shortwave radios, which is kind of funny because I don't have a transmitter. But anyway, I've noticed that shortwave has been pretty much dead. As in, I don't get anything. It just so happened that it's just the atmosphere just not being right for this time of the solar cycle, or the other question too is really maybe my radio is dead.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've definitely tuned around some on shortwave and found some stuff, but anybody have a good answer for Ben about that?
I'll try. You're right. If you tune around right now, there'll be some stuff there, but for those of us who've been around for decades, there's not much. You're right. We're pretty much at the minimum of the cycle, like I said, between 24 and 25. For instance, the Boulder ionogram is showing F0, F2 at roughly 2.7, 2.8 megahertz. That means everything orthogonal, perpendicular, straight up from the Earth, that is NVIS. Anything much above that frequency will sail off into deep space, and so much for communicating on Earth. However, as angles get lower, grazing angles, right now it's showing about 8.6 megahertz for the Boulder ionogram. Anything much above that for a 3,000 kilometer distance, you're not going to hear anything. There's just not enough ionization to support refraction at frequencies much above that. So yeah, you're right. There isn't much there.
So that will start to improve toward the peak of the cycle?
Absolutely, but we're going to have to wait.
W0ASP with a comment?
Yeah, go ahead, Terry.
I think part of the discussion there was the shortwave listening, and that all, of course, depends on the transmitter. And one has to realize that in the last decade or two, that most governments have shut down their propaganda arms on shortwave radio and have switched those over to the internet. So you're not hearing a lot of shortwave broadcasts anymore. Many of those stations have shut down.
You got pretty quiet again there, Terry. But yeah, a lot of those transmitters that you used to hear about have shut down. But aren't there still some of those out there that are some of those mysterious shortwave transmitters? Aren't some of those still out there?
What you find mostly on shortwave are the religious broadcasters. Like Terry commented, with very low audio. Most of the propaganda machines have been shut down. Cost money to run them, they shut them down. So what you get today are mostly religious broadcasters and want your money.
And Cuba and China.
Yeah, actually listening to radio, what is it, RCI, Radio China International, or is it I get that confused with Radio Catholic International, CRI, Catholic Radio International. Actually, China is interesting to listen to. If you listen to the broadcast, they try their absolute best to appear as Western as they possibly can.
Yeah, getting into the shortwave is definitely pretty interesting. So, what can listening excuse me, what can listening to the various shortwaves and what I can hear on shortwaves, what does that tell me about where I can transmit, as we're talking that it goes both ways? Is that going to be a decent representation of 40 meters or whatnot?
Yes and no, and probably more on the no side than yes. Many of the international broadcasters that are left today have transmitters outside their geographic areas. Several of them are in the Caribbean. I know Radio China International has several transmitters that are far closer to the U.S. and beam the U.S. Than CONUS, within the borders of China. So, yes and no, with a bias toward the no.
This is Whiskey Zero Delta Delta Zulu net control for the Northern Colorado Amateur Radio Club TechNet. Do we have any questions so far about anything we've discussed, or any HF propagation questions? Please call.
Amateurs we can hear from other countries to get an idea of propagation for us.
Oh, I'm sorry, Greg. I doubled with you. You want to come again?
I was just saying that the international broadcasters can run 1 million watts of power or more with very directional antennas, and we're not going to be able to duplicate that kind of power output and directivity. So for us, it's a lot better to listen to other amateur radio operators in other countries that are running similar antennas and similar power levels to what we run, to get an idea for us as to what our useful propagation is going to be in 0 EMP. And Terry, you were good. You were good now.
Yeah, and again, Greg, listening to some of the online SDRs is just worth its weight in gold. W0LEB. Go ahead, Terry.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I hope I got my radio problems resolved. Had to power cycle the thing.
Yeah, that was a great transmission, Terry. Go ahead. W0DDZ.
shortwave listening is a fine art that is certainly worthwhile, and you will learn a lot about propagation, even though, as Greg says, yes, these guys run with megawatt acres of antenna aperture, and they can blast through conditions that we cannot. However, that's what the VCAP propagation prediction programs that people use, they were all invented specifically for the purpose of Voice of America, to determine where it can and cannot propagate to. So if you use a prediction program, a lot of these programs were based on trying to determine where these high-power, high-aperture radio stations can and cannot transmit to.
Yeah, it's definitely pretty interesting. I have heard some stuff, but definitely not as much stuff as I've read about,
KC0, Kyokan Echolink.
Hey, good evening, Marty. Go ahead.
Good evening, Dave. Everybody else. 2 questions. You're talking about listening to see where other amateurs are talking from. Are there beacons? Or there used to be beacons? Are there still beacons for each band or frequencies? And I guess it would be band for us, but. And also, at what point does shortwave not become shortwave anymore? I guess at what frequency does shortwave stop and go on to, I guess, longer wavelengths?
Yeah, answer's a little bit nebulous, but generally HF is considered 3 to 30 megahertz. Maybe a little lower than that. MF is, bottom of the broadcast band down a little bit to 3 megahertz. VHF generally is considered to start at 50 megahertz or 6 meter band. Certainly that's the magic band. It behaves very different than HF or even VHF when sporadic E or E layer is active.
So, and you said that the shortwave was the HF band?
Yeah, all a shortwave would be HF, 3 to 30 megahertz. And during the 57 and 60 peak, yeah, there were shortwave broadcasts all the way up 25 megahertz.
So I know that covered one of your questions. What was your other question, Marty?
Well, I was wondering if the beacons are still being used to try and determine propagation.
Beacons are active on virtually all of the VHF, UHF frequencies. 10 meters, they're active. I can't speak for 15, but generally from there on down, no, there are no beacons.
Copy that. All right. And I guess, and another thing, just because you're scanning the band and twisting that dial doesn't mean there's nobody out there. Pick a frequency and start talking on it. Because if everybody just sits around and spins the dial, there's nobody going to be doing any talking, so you got to get out there and keep the microphone down then too. All right, now let it go back to the great conversation. KC0QOK up here around Guernsey, Wyoming.
EMP.
And I don't want to redirect all of this, but as far as HF goes, you're absolutely right, Marty. I tune across 40 meters in the daytime, and there's nothing there, even in the CW region. But the FT8 windows are probably a very good indicator of what's going on. You don't even have to decode it. Just look at the FT8 frequencies, and it'll tell you whether the band is open or not. W0LEV.
No, I heard EMP under there. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, in lieu of the old HF beacons, which there might still be some around, but probably not too many, what we have now, in addition to FT8 that Dave just mentioned, we have Whisper. And there's a website called WhisperNet, WSPRNET.org. And they use low-power digital data transmissions on HF, on the amateur bands, on all of the amateur bands from every country. And there's online transmitters and there's online receivers. And it maps out continually what paths are open on what bands from anywhere to anywhere else. So that's a very comprehensive source for looking online to see what's open, and zero EMP.
So, and that's Whisper, and using those digital modes give us a good idea of how stuff is propagating in HF.
Yeah, Whisper is a part of the WSJTX applications. You don't have to download those. Like Greg said, you can just access the site WhisperNet, and you can see what's active, what's not active. It's all posted pretty much real time.
RXS.
Yeah, go ahead, Randy.
One I use a lot, well, most of the time actually, is dxmaps.com. DX Mike Alpha Papa.com. Or, no, I forgot Sierra. dxmaps.com. I think everybody got that. It shows propagation worldwide. And it's pretty useful to see if something's happening or not, whether it's worth tuning in or not.
Yeah, I definitely love finding these tools. They're nice and helpful to finding this information out quickly. Any other questions for tonight's Northern Colorado Amateur Radio Club TechNet? Please call.
And zero EMP.
Go ahead, Greg.
There's a rare phenomenon I've heard about. I've never heard it firsthand, but I've heard accounts of it, and it's HF, and it's called a long delay echo, or LDE. And the way the story goes, you'll have someone doing a DXQSO, usually on voice, but I guess it could be CW. And they unkey their mic, and they hear an echo of the last few seconds of their own transmission. And this is simplex. This isn't through a repeater or anything else like that. And the ionosphere is too close for you to really have that kind of delay with the round-trip travel time. So I'm wondering, in particular, Terry, with his atmospheric research background, if he's heard of this and if he's heard of an explanation for it. N0EMP.
Greg, I have experienced that, maybe half a dozen times in my amateur, quote, career, unquote. Yeah, the ionosphere is too close, but the explanation first came out of Los Alamos about 25 years ago. I was living in Albuquerque at the time, and your signal injects into a plasma bottle, reflects from the poles, and comes out the same spigot it went in, or very close. That exists in the magnetosphere, not the ionosphere, and it's a bit spooky. But yeah, I first experienced it on CW. I've heard it on 40 and 80 meters, sideband on 80, CW on 40. It's spooky, but it's real.
W0ASP.
Go ahead, Terry.
I think what Greg was talking about was something called an interhemispheric propagation mode, or a condition where, on the right geometry, an HF propagating wave can not just reflect from the ionosphere back to the ground, but can actually start propagating parallel to the Earth's magnetic field. And that'll propagate to the opposite hemisphere, reflect off the ground there, and then propagate back along the magnetospheric field lines and back to the station. And yeah, you can have hundreds of milliseconds of time delay with that kind of propagation path.
Okay, so since this can occur, is that ever a mode of propagation that's deliberately used, maybe by the government or anyone, or is it too unstable and unpredictable to be practical to use?
My understanding of the the WK curves, the frequency wavelength propagation curves in the ionosphere, it requires a mode coupling between a TEM, a transverse electromagnetic mode, to what's called a Whistler mode, which is a longitudinal propagation mode. And usually that requires ionospheric irregularities to achieve. It's somewhat similar to what's called the Z mode in high latitude propagation.
It's probably rare enough to use professionally or clandestinely by uncle.
Okay, thanks, N0EMP.
Zero D&D.
Yeah, go ahead, Mac.
Make some comments about what I've been listening to. A whole lot of engineering talk going on, and one of the things we don't think about, we're at the time of day where that propagation becomes its best because the ionosphere becomes as dense as what it is. We're going into the time of the year where that we set in much earlier than what we'd think about in the day to get to it, and because during the day we've got cold, so the ionosphere condenses, makes reflection a whole lot better. And the final one is the one that most people don't want to hear. You can't engineer the point to where you're going to make an absolute contact. Turn off the computer, turn on the transceiver, find you a place that sounds good, you hear some noise, and start calling. And whenever you made a few calls with it, somebody may come back to you, they may not. If they don't, start calling again. If you make enough noise, eventually somebody's going to come back to you. And I wasn't trying to step on toes. I'm just back to old folks doing things like that. Sorry about throwing it at you, but that's my comment, N0DNB.
Yeah, in the amateur spirit, I second your comments. There's a guy there in Loveland who does exactly that. He doesn't even look for conditions. He just finds an empty spot and calls CQ. And invariably, after a minute or 5 minutes or maybe 10, he's ultimately rewarded with a contact, W0LEV. And I need a sign, guys. W0LEV, gonna go to supper.
This is Whiskey Zero, Delta Delta Zulu, Dave, net control for tonight's Northern Colorado Amateur Radio Club net. And yeah, thanks, Dave, for giving us all those answers you did. There was a lot of learning tonight for me. I definitely learned a lot. It's always nice to get into these topics with you. Any other questions for tonight's net? Please call.
W0ASP with a comment.
Yeah, go ahead, Terry.
Well, I have to second Mac's opinion on this because, yeah, sooner or later all this theory just breaks down, and what you need to do is actually get a message from one place to another, and the only way to do that is to key up the transmitter and see who comes back to you. You know, this is all fine and dandy in terms of discussing this, but it is like forecasting the weather.
One last comment in parting, please.
Go ahead, Dave.
I have to relate my wife's comment, who is pretty much non-science, married to somebody with a physics degree, heaven forbid, after 39 plus years. Her comment is, remember, science is man's best explanation of what's right in front of his nose. I think there's a bit of wisdom in that. W0LEV off to the kitchen.
I do imagine there is some wisdom in that comment for sure.
N0DNB. I got a topic for you to say in with sometime. See what comes out of it. Man, you talk about being broad and lots of area to cover. It's antenna radiation. What makes an antenna radiate? Try that sometime, and you'll find some real interesting things. I know I've been messing with some of the guys that reasonably new hams that's got a higher class license than I have, and some that's been around for a long time, and none of them seem to understand why an antenna radiates.
That was one of the subjects. I emailed Kevin one of 30 or 30 plus subjects. It'll come up sooner or later on this TechNet, I guarantee. W0LEV, really, I need to go to the kitchen. Put the mic down.
Well, thanks for hanging out with us tonight, Dave. I appreciate it. Yes, and this is that is definitely a good topic. And I know I have sent Kevin quite a few topics, but I'll make sure to send this one to him as well. Again, maybe it'll get it moved up the list. But yeah, it's a good time to mention that if you guys do have a topic that you want to discuss or have us discuss, send it into Elmers at NCARC.net. That's Echo Limo, Echo Mike Sierra at November Charlie Alpha Romeo Charlie.net. Any other questions about HF propagation? Please call. We have definitely covered quite a bit of ground tonight on the TechNet, and our TechNets are definitely available on YouTube to go back over, and the links, the websites that we've discussed, I have, as we've been talking, got them into the description. So if you want to find those links, they are in our YouTube page, NCARC, or youtube.com/NCARC. Do we have any general questions for the net or anything outside of topic? Please call now. Anything anybody wants to add? Any comments, questions, anything for the net? Please call.
KC0KOK. I was wondering if anybody out there is familiar with the Uniden Home Patrol scanner. I have a friend of mine up here in Wyoming that bought one, and he's tried to program it. I brought it home. I looked at it, and somehow or another got it locked up. I don't know. My patience is running thin. Is anybody out there familiar with that scanner? KC0QOK.
Anybody used that scanner? Can tell Marty anything about it? You said it was locked up, Marty?
Yeah, I tried. Yeah, it's, I can't remember now. It's been a while since I turned it on and looked at it, but I can't get it to do anything. So, yeah, somehow or another I've done something to it. But I just, excuse me, I want to get a few. He's up in Lusk, Wyoming. There's not a heck of a lot to listen to, so get state and some county and local law enforcement up there and EMS and stuff, and I'd like to get that up to him. He had a really bad wreck a few years ago and got paralyzed, and it'd just be a little bit some sort of form of entertainment.
So just digging around a bit on Google, are you able to go into like a manual mode, like push the manual button and go to like a frequency directly?
I think so, Dave. Maybe I'll get with you when I get back home and get it turned on and see if we can't figure something out.
So it seems like the two answers are that it needs to be actually set up with frequencies and whatnot. So going to manual and putting in this frequency and putting it into memory, or if it's seriously locked up, then a lot of times it looks like there's a master reset on several of Uniden's models that would restore it to factory settings, and that might fix the problem.
Okay, I hadn't even thought about going to Google looking at that. I just don't have patience with that kind of stuff. That sounds like probably what it needs to do, get a factory reset, start from fresh. You're supposed to be able to enter the zip code, and then it downloads frequencies, and you're good to go. And that hasn't happened, so I'm gonna just have to manually input it, and that would work. I'll do that reset thing.
Yeah, that might be the easiest answer. On this model that I see them discussing, it's turn off the scanner, then while holding 2-9 and the hold button, turn on the scanner, and it'll take it about 3 seconds to initialize, and then clear appears.
All right, that sounds good. I'll bet that'll do it. Then I can manually input the frequencies and get it back up to him.
Yeah, it's always nice to get something like that fixed, for sure. Any other questions for the Ned, either about HF propagation or any of your tech needs? We always try to get some general questions in before we close the net. Hearing none, it's definitely went over a lot this net. I don't know that I've gotten Kevin's topic for next week yet. I will look here one real quick to see if I see next week's topic. If not, nope, it doesn't seem like I do. So we will get that out on the website. You can check out at ncarc.net. And if you have topics or questions, send that to Elmers at ncarc.net. We definitely love to get that stuff and have a distribution list to get questions answered as they come up. Anybody have anything else for the net before we close up for the evening? Please call.
N0PF.
Yeah, go ahead.
I got here late, but just thought I would check in with you. My name is Steve at Loveland by Boys Lake here, so thanks for letting me check in, and next time I'll try to get in a little bit earlier. This is N0BF.
No problem. Glad to have you along. Anything else for the net before we close for the evening? Well, my thanks to everybody for your participation. I definitely got a lot of stuff on the net, and like I said, I did try to get all the links we discussed put into the description field on the YouTube page. So if you want to go back over this, it'll be posted on the YouTube page after the NED. There's a little bit of processing time, but thank you to everybody who participated. This is Whiskey 0 Delta Delta Zulu for the Northern Colorado Amateur Radio Club TechNet. The net is now closed and the repeater is open for general use. This presentation was brought to you by the Northern Colorado Amateur Radio Club. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.